She moaned. Easy? It hurts. The rancher said softly, It'll be over quick, Wild West romance story. The small town of Broken Creek sat quietly in the middle of a wide desert valley. Dusty roads ran between wooden buildings, and the wind often carried the sound of horses and distant cattle. Most days were slow and peaceful. Everyone in town knew each other, and nothing new ever seemed to happen. But one warm afternoon, something unusual did happen. A young woman arrived in town. Her name was Elena Brooks. She stepped down from the stagecoach with a small suitcase and tired eyes. The long journey had covered her clothes with dust, but she stood tall and looked around with quiet determination. She had traveled a long way to reach Broken Creek. The townspeople noticed her immediately. In a place where strangers were rare, a new face always caught attention. Old Mr. Harris, who owned the general store, leaned on his wooden counter and watched from the doorway. Well, that's someone new, he said to the barber next door. The barber nodded slowly. Sure is. Elena walked down the street carefully, looking at the buildings and signs. She wasn't sure where to start, but she knew one thing for certain. She had come here to begin a new life. Not far outside town stood a large ranch called Carter Ranch. The ranch belonged to Daniel Carter, a quiet and hard-working rancher who kept mostly to himself. Daniel was known across Broken Creek as a man of few words. He worked long hours, took good care of his horses, and rarely spent time in town unless he needed supplies. Some people said he was lonely. Others said he simply preferred silence. That afternoon, Daniel rode into town on his dark brown horse to pick up feed and tools. As he tied his horse near the general store, he noticed Elena standing near the water pump, trying to lift a heavy bucket. She struggled with it, clearly not used to the hard work of ranch life. Daniel watched for a moment. Then he stepped forward. Careful, he said calmly. Elena looked up, surprised. She hadn't noticed him approaching. Daniel gently took the bucket from her hands and lifted it with ease. Thank you, she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I guess I'm not used to this yet. Daniel nodded once. You new in town? Yes, Elena replied. I just arrived today. Daniel placed the bucket beside the pump and filled it for her. Broken Creek can be a tough place if you're alone, he said. Elena gave a small smile. I've been through tougher places. For the first time, Daniel looked at her more carefully. There was something strong in her eyes, something determined. Before he could say more, Elena suddenly lost her balance as she stepped back from the pump. The ground was uneven, and her foot slipped on the loose dirt. She gasped softly as she fell. Daniel moved quickly and caught her before she hit the ground, steadying her by the arm. Easy, he said in a low voice. You all right? Elena winced slightly. My ankle, I think I twisted it. Daniel helped her sit down on a wooden bench outside the store. He crouched beside her and examined her ankle carefully. It's not broken, he said after a moment, just strained. Elena let out a relieved breath. That's good news. Daniel stood and walked into the general store. A minute later, he returned with a small cloth and a piece of ice wrapped inside it. Put this on it, he said. Elena looked surprised. You didn't have to do that. Daniel shrugged slightly. It'll help. She placed the ice on her ankle and sighed softly. Thank you, Mr. Carter, he said. Daniel Carter. Recognition appeared on her face. The rancher? Daniel nodded. Elena smiled again, this time more warmly. Well, Mr. Carter, I'm Elena Brooks. They sat in silence for a moment while the wind moved gently through the quiet street. From the doorway of the general store, Mr. Harris watched them with interest. Something about the moment felt important, though he couldn't explain why. After a few minutes, Elena carefully stood up. Her ankle still hurt, but she could walk. I think I'll manage, she said. Daniel looked at her for a moment. You staying in town? For now, she replied, but I'm looking for work. Daniel considered this quietly. Running a ranch required help, and finding reliable workers was never easy. Most people avoided the long days and hard labor. Finally, he spoke. If you're serious about work, he said, Carter Ranch could use an extra hand. Elena blinked in surprise. You mean that? Daniel nodded. It's not easy work. Elena straightened her shoulders. I didn't come all this way for easy. For the first time that day, a faint smile appeared on Daniel Carter's face. Then welcome to Broken Creek, he said. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over the wide land of Broken Creek. Golden light spread across the hills and open fields. Birds flew over the ranch, and the air smelled fresh and cool. At Carter Ranch, the day had already begun. Daniel Carter was standing near the horse stable, checking the fences. Like every morning, he had woken up before sunrise. Hard work was part of his life, and he never complained about it. Soon he heard the sound of slow footsteps behind him. Elena Brooks was walking toward the stable. She moved carefully because her ankle was still a little sore, but she looked determined. Daniel noticed her and raised an eyebrow. "You sure you should be walking already?" he asked. Elena smiled slightly. "It feels better today," she said. "And you did say the work here isn't easy." Daniel looked at her for a moment. He had expected her to change her mind after one night. Most people did. But Elena was different. He nodded toward the stable. "All right then. First lesson, horses." Inside the stable, several horses stood quietly in their stalls. Some were strong work horses, while others were younger and full of energy. Elena looked around with interest. "I've never worked on a ranch before," she admitted. Daniel picked up a brush and handed it to her. "Then we start simple." He showed her how to brush the horse slowly and calmly. The horse moved its ears but stayed relaxed. "Elena," Daniel said, "horses understand calm people. If you stay calm, they trust you." Elena nodded and followed his movements carefully. At first her hands were unsure, but slowly she became more confident. Daniel watched quietly. For someone new, she was learning quickly. After the horses were brushed and fed, Daniel showed her the next job, checking the water troughs across the ranch. They rode out together on horseback. The land around Carter Ranch was wide and beautiful. Tall grass moved with the wind, and distant mountains stood quietly under the blue sky. Elena looked around with wonder. "It's beautiful here," she said. Daniel glanced toward the hills. "Most people only see the hard work." "I see both," Elena replied. They stopped at the first water trough. Daniel climbed down and checked the water level. Elena tried to do the same, but when she stepped down from her horse, her ankle twisted slightly. She grabbed the saddle quickly to keep her balance. Daniel noticed immediately. "I thought you said it was better," he said. Elena gave a small laugh. "It is better, just not perfect." Daniel walked over and checked the trough himself. "You don't have to prove anything," he said calmly. "I know," Elena replied, "but I want to help." There was a short silence. Daniel respected that answer. They continued riding across the ranch, checking fences and guiding a small group of cattle back toward the pasture. Elena watched carefully as Daniel worked. He moved with quiet skill, giving simple commands to the horses and cattle. At one point, a young calf wandered away from the herd. Daniel pointed. "Go slow. Guide it back." Elena rode her horse carefully toward the calf. She remembered Daniel's earlier advice, "Stay calm." The calf turned and slowly walked back toward the herd. When she returned, Daniel gave a small nod of approval. "Not bad for your first day." Elena smiled proudly. As the day continued, the sun climbed higher in the sky. The work was long and tiring, but Elena never complained. By late afternoon, both of them were sitting near the wooden fence outside the barn. Elena wiped the dust from her hands. "You weren't joking about the work," she said. Daniel leaned back against the fence. "Nope." A gentle breeze moved through the fields, carrying the soft sound of distant cattle. For a while, neither of them spoke. Finally, Elena looked toward the mountains. "Why did you stay here?" she asked. Daniel looked thoughtful. "My father built this ranch," he said quietly. "After he passed away, it became my responsibility." Elena nodded slowly. "Sounds like it means a lot to you." Daniel looked across the land. "It does." Then he turned slightly toward her. "What about you? Why Broken Creek?" Elena was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes people just need a place to start again," she said softly. Daniel didn't ask more questions. He understood that some stories took time to tell. As the sun slowly moved toward the horizon, The sky turned orange and gold. Elena stood up and looked across the ranch. "You know," she said, "this place feels different in the evening." Daniel followed her gaze. "That's the best time of day here." They stood there for a moment, watching the sunset. For Daniel, the ranch had always been quiet and lonely. But now, for the first time in a long while, it felt a little less emptied out a few weeks past at Carter Ranch, and Elena slowly became part of the daily life there. The work was still hard, but she was learning something new every day. Each morning began before sunrise. Elena would walk to the stable, while the sky was still dark blue. The horses would greet her with soft sounds, and she would brush them just like Daniel had taught her. Daniel noticed a change. At first she had been unsure and careful. Now she moved with confidence. One morning, while they were fixing a fence near the far pasture, the wind suddenly grew stronger. Daniel looked toward the sky. Dark clouds were gathering over the hills of Red Valley. "That storm's coming faster than I thought," he said. Elena followed his gaze. The clouds looked heavy and gray. "Is that bad?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "If the storm gets strong, the cattle might scatter." They quickly finished repairing the fence and rode back toward the main ranch area. The wind kept getting stronger, pushing the tall grass in every direction. By afternoon, the sky had turned dark. The air felt tense and quiet, like the land was waiting. Daniel stepped out of the barn and looked across the pasture. Then he saw something that made him frown. The gate near the lower field had come loose in the wind. Several cattle had already begun moving toward the open land. "We need to move them before the storm hits," Daniel said quickly. Elena didn't hesitate. "I'll help." They jumped onto their horses and rode across the field. The wind was loud now, and dust blew across the ground. The cattle were restless. Some were already walking toward the open hills. Daniel rode ahead and guided part of the herd back toward the pasture. Elena followed behind, helping keep the animals together. "Easy, easy," she said softly as she rode beside them. The animals slowly turned back toward the ranch. Just then, a loud thunder sound echoed across the valley. The storm had arrived. Rain began to fall in large drops. The wind pushed harder, making it difficult to see clearly. Daniel rode closer to Elena. "We just need to get them through the main gate," he called. Elena nodded. Together they guided the herd toward the wooden fence near the barn. One stubborn cow suddenly ran toward the side field. Elena turned her horse quickly and rode after it. "Come on," she said calmly. The cow slowed down and turned back toward the herd. A few minutes later, the last of the cattle finally moved through the gate. Daniel quickly closed it. They both rode into the barn just as the rain began pouring heavily. The storm roared outside. Wind shook the barn doors, and rain tapped loudly against the roof. Elena climbed down from her horse and brushed the wet hair from her face. "That was intense," she said with a breathless laugh. Daniel removed his hat and shook the rain from it. "You handled it well." Elena leaned against a wooden post, catching her breath. "I just followed your lead." For a moment, the two of them stood there, listening to the storm outside. The barn felt warm and safe compared to the wild weather outside. After a while, Elena spoke again. "Daniel, can I ask you something?" Daniel nodded. "What is it?" Elena looked thoughtful. "People in town say you used to ride with other ranchers, but now you work alone. Why?" Daniel was quiet. The rain continued falling outside, filling the silence. Finally he answered. "A few years ago, I trusted the wrong people," he said slowly. "A business deal went bad. I nearly lost this ranch." Elena listened carefully. "Since then," Daniel continued, "I've kept things simple. Just the ranch, the animals, and the work." Elena nodded with understanding. "That must have been hard." Daniel looked around the barn. "It taught me to be careful." Another loud thunder sound rolled across the sky. Elena stepped closer to the barn door and looked outside at the heavy rain. "You know," she said softly, "everyone has a past they're trying to move forward from." Daniel looked at her. "Even you?" Elena smiled slightly. "Yes, especially me." The storm slowly began to weaken. The rain became lighter and the wind calmed. Daniel walked to the barn door and opened it slightly. The sky was clearing and the sun was beginning to break through the clouds. Golden light spread across the wet fields. Elena stepped beside him and looked out at the peaceful land. The ranch had survived the storm, and somehow the long, difficult day had brought them closer. Neither of them said it out loud, but both of them felt it. For the first time in years, Daniel Carter was beginning to trust someone again, and Elena Brooks was starting to feel like she had finally found a place where she truly belonged. But the story of Carter Ranch was not finished yet. The morning after the storm was quiet and fresh. The sky above Carter Ranch was bright blue, and the land looked clean after the heavy rain. Drops of water still rested on the tall grass, shining in the sunlight. Elena stepped out of the small ranch house and looked across the fields. The air smelled fresh, and the wind was calm again. After the long, stormy night, everything felt peaceful. In the distance, she could see Daniel Carter near the barn, already busy with the morning work. Just like always, he had started the day early. Elena walked toward the barn, her boots moving softly across the damp ground. Daniel was checking the horses when he noticed her. "Morning," he said. "Morning." Elena replied with a small smile. "How's the ankle?" "Much better now," she said. "Thanks to your help." Daniel nodded and handed her a small bucket of feed. "Well, the horses are hungry." Elena laughed lightly. "I'm learning that ranch life doesn't slow down." Together, they worked through the morning. They fed the horses, checked the fences that had been shaken by the storm, and walked through the pasture to make sure the cattle were safe. The land had survived the storm well. The fences still stood, the animals were calm, and the ranch looked stronger than ever. As the afternoon arrived, the warm sunlight spread across the valley. Elena stood near the wooden fence and looked out over the open land. "This place really is special," she said quietly. Daniel walked over and leaned on the fence beside her. "My father used to say that land like this takes care of people who take care of it." Elena nodded. I think he was right. For a moment, they both watched the wide fields in silence. Then Daniel spoke again. "You've done good work here, Elena." She looked at him with a curious expression. "Does that mean I pass a ranch test?" Daniel allowed a small smile. "Something like that." They both laughed softly. Later that evening, the sun began to sink toward the horizon. The sky slowly turned shades of orange, pink, and gold. Daniel walked toward the horse stable and saddled 2 horses. Elena noticed and walked over. "Where are we going?" Daniel adjusted the saddle. "There's something I want to show you." A few minutes later, they rode away from the ranch toward a small hill that overlooked the entire valley. The ride was quiet and peaceful. The evening wind moved gently through the grass as the sun continued to set. When they reached the top of the hill, Daniel stopped his horse. Below them, the entire land of Broken Creek stretched out like a painting. The ranch fields, the distant town, and the winding river were all glowing in the warm sunset light. Elena looked around in amazement. "This view is incredible." Daniel stepped down from his horse. "My father used to come here every evening," he said. He said it helped him remember why the ranch was worth fighting for. Elena climbed down as well and stood beside him. The quiet sunset filled the sky with color. After a moment, Daniel spoke again. "When you first arrived in Broken Creek," he said, "I didn't expect anything to change." Elena listened carefully. "I had gotten used to being alone," Daniel continued. "Just the work, the ranch, and the long days." He looked out across the valley. But things started feeling different. Elena smiled slightly. "Different how?" Daniel looked at her. "This place feels less empty now." Elena's expression softened. The evening wind moved gently around them. "I came here hoping for a new start," Elena said quietly. "I didn't know if Broken Creek would accept me." Daniel shook his head. "You earned your place here." They stood side by side, watching the last light of the sun fade across the valley. Then Daniel spoke again, his voice calm but sincere. "Elena, if you want to stay, Carter Ranch will always have a place for you." Elena looked at him, surprised. "You mean as a ranch worker?" she asked with a playful smile. Daniel smiled back. "Well, that too." They both laughed softly. But Elena understood what he truly meant. She looked out across the land once more, the wide fields, the quiet ranch, and the peaceful valley. For the first time in a long time, she felt certain about the future. "I think I'd like to stay," she said. Daniel nodded. The sun slowly disappeared behind the distant mountains, leaving the sky glowing with the last warm light of the day. High on the hill above Broken Creek, two people stood quietly, looking toward the future. The ranch had survived storms, hard days, and long nights, but now it held something new, hope. And as the evening stars began to appear above the valley, Carter Ranch was no longer just a place of work.